All right, so today's research roundup gets into two topics that one, which is pretty relevant to the way we coach, just because we use RIR and RPE so much, and then one is very relevant to basically anybody that is a human being living in the world, listening to this podcast, because we all have to wear masks. So we're going to dive into that as well, which I'm excited about. So let's just jump right into it and go into that first study, and then we'll kind of start the conversation.
Yeah. So both these studies are like brand new. I've been picking older studies, but these are like published in the past 2 months.
Nice.
So just because of our lag and stuff, there's a little bit of lag. But anyway, so this study was basically comparing no mask versus a surgical mask versus a cloth mask. So most people wear cloth masks just because they're easier. They're not, health related. Um, and what they did was very simple. It was just an incremental exercise test to failure. So they got on a bike and they pedaled, and then every 2 minutes, like, it would get harder. So your wattage goes up. And then it was just to exhaustion, or like when the participant would tap out. So they did this in each kind of condition. So the no mask, the surgical mask, and the cloth mask, and it was randomized, and the design was really good. And they had at least, I think it was 2 to 3 days between tests, so they weren't like fatigued. And the main outcome, kind of like the one that most people care about, is that the time to exhaustion was not different if you wore a mask, or even like if you wore a surgical or a cloth mask. So they're basically all the same. These participants could go about the same distance, which would looks about like 10 minutes, 10 to 11 minutes before they tapped out. So that was the kind of the main finding. The really interesting finding on the physiological level was on oxygen saturation. So you've probably heard with COVID that there's an oxygen saturation issue where they put, you go into the hospital, they put a thing on your finger and it measures arterial oxygen saturation. So they had one of those on during the test, and it did not change anything. So that's good. There's no issues with oxygenation. They also used a non-infrared spectroscopy device on the thigh. So as they're pedaling, they're measuring blood oxygen in the muscle of your vastus lateralis, basically. And it's much lower than like your finger, if you just look at the percentages. But again, they didn't find anything different there. So that those two things tell us that, okay, so you're wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, you can get the same amount of oxygen into your body and to your muscles. And it doesn't affect fatigue, presumably, from this. So those are the main findings. It was kind of a shorter, sweet study, like it's just very direct, which is nice to have.
It's actually surprising. I would have guessed that it would hinder results in some way, or the ability to train hard in some way. Do you think there's any mental component to that? Because my thought is too, is like some people actually get anxiety from being able to do that. And I've heard people use the excuse of like MMA fighters using the elevation masks. And like one guy had like the smartest like reasoning that I've ever heard, was like, it's extremely uncomfortable and hard to breathe, which prepares them mentally for what's going to happen in the ring. I was like, oh, that's a good point, but do you think there's a mental aspect to this too that could change the results?
So they did measure RPE, and that's your pseudo mental aspect, I guess. But they didn't find any differences between the masks, which I was kind of surprised. And I agree with you that mentally, you're just kind of, sometimes when you wear a mask, it's harder to like go hard. So that was kind of surprising. Now there's a couple other studies that this kind of piggybacked off of, but basically all of them have found that no matter what kind of mask you wear, your performance doesn't really decline. Now the kind of limitation to this specific study, I think, is it was done in like September, so most people had been wearing masks for a while by then, and these people had been training, like they were trained, at least in endurance, so they probably had been exercising a mask, but it's still good to see.
So there could have been a slight adaptation process there. Like I'm sure it might have been, maybe not, but it might have been different if I threw on a mask and started training, because I haven't trained with a mask on ever. You know, I've never even
Yeah.
worn an elevation mask, so it would be a completely new ball game for me.
Yeah, yeah, and it took me a while to adapt to. I think one of the things, like, these are shorter tests, right? So they're like 10 minutes, 12 minutes, somewhere in there. But over the course of a workout, like if you sweat heavy, and I'm pretty cold now, so I don't really sweat much, but your mask can get kind of bogged down, so it can even like make it more mentally challenging to breathe through like a kind of wet mask. Um, but I assume that these people were also sweating if they're, maxing out on a bike. So I'd be curious to see how that affects things too, like a longer workout versus just like a 5-10 minute thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Is there, you might not have looked in of the research, but the effectiveness of the mask from like prevention of COVID and things like that. I mean, there's so much talk about it being either way, and I have no idea. I haven't looked into it, but have you looked into that at all? Like, is it worth it?
Um, so I have, and well, I have a little bit because stuff comes out so fast on that. Like there was
Mhm.
probably like 5 studies published very rapidly on that topic. And the last time I checked, it was kind of like either way, depending on what kind of research design you like and how you like your data analyzed, and all the fine things about research. But um, yeah, so I can't say either way for sure, but it is kind of required where I'm at, so don't
Yeah.
really have a choice.
I mean, it's definitely not going to hurt. So
Yeah,
it's
for
almost
sure.
like if we don't know for sure, then why not, use it? But
Yeah.
I also think it's funny too that like, and this is a common topic for some of the gym owners I know are just going haywire on Instagram and stuff, and I don't blame them because their gyms are getting shut down, and like there's quite a bit of research showing that gyms are the least common place to transmit COVID, and we also know, and I'd actually love to get like the science behind this for the people listening, like building your aerobic base, building like doing resistance training, even cardiovascular system improves your immune system to fight off things like that, So um, realistically, we should be training and we shouldn't take people out of the gym because that's going to help them, fight this off.
Yeah. And so exercise immunology is probably one of my weaker areas, but most data, there's at least a correlation of like exercise helps you not get sick as much, just broadly speaking. Now there's a couple like components to that. It's, hey, when you exercise, people who exercise probably are just healthier in general, so that helps. If you're in a gym, it's not, I wouldn't call it dirty, but you're exposed to a lot of things, right? It's kind of like having kids. Like you just get
Yeah.
whatever they get.
Yeah.
So whatever environment you're in, it's the same people generally, but you're exposed to more stimulus for your system. So I think maybe I'll have to look into the research a little bit more on that aspect, because that's pretty big.
I think it's a good one. And it gets like, I think for me, because you're so right, man. Like my daughter got sick, not COVID, but like just last week. And me and Shannon both looked at each other and we're like, oh shit, how many days do we got before we get it? And so she got it, but I was like taking vitamins and drinking water and like sanitizing and wiping everything down. And she's like, oh, now you clean. And I'm like, oh yeah. And I didn't get anything. I was like, I don't want like, it was funny because I went through like 3 different things that really like screwed up my training for 3 weeks in a row. And then and I was like, I'm not skipping more training this week. I'm going to make sure that like mentally I'm not getting sick. And I didn't. But it's true. You be around that more, you will adapt. And I think training in general, like since I started getting pretty healthy and fit, I've noticed a huge decrease in doctor visits and getting sick and the need for Dayquil and all that kind of stuff. But I think more than anything, like seeing studies like this is cool too, because a lot of people will use the excuse to not train because it's uncomfortable with the mask, because it's hard to breathe, and they give themselves that excuse, even if like they still go to the gym and they're not using it as an excuse to not go to the gym, but maybe they're using it as an excuse when they get to rep 5. They're like, oh, this is uncomfortable. Like, I'm going to stop early. And they kind of give themselves more wiggle room because they have a mask on, quote unquote. And this kind of proves like, hey, no, your performance is fine. Don't slow down. Don't stop. Keep going.
Yeah. It's and the more you do it, the more you I think get used to it too. I've been so shoot. I had to start training with a mask back in March, or April at least. But I have certain masks now that are like not thinner necessarily, but better at wicking like sweat and stuff. And so I have like this array of masks that like, okay, this is my leg day mask, and this is my running mask, and this is my like casual workout upper body mask.
Well, that's like the TCM ones I got made for everybody. They're like thick cotton. So like whenever I wear that, like I get like the craziest mustache beard sweat ever, and I'm just in the grocery store. So yeah, you got to be careful with which ones you're wearing. But
Yeah,
no, this is
I use that one for the upper body workouts generally.
yeah, that's a safe bet. I was gonna say that's definitely not a leg day or a cardio mask for sure. I had to the longest like so I got a tattoo and it was like I was there 8 hours for 3 days in a row and I had to wear a mask the whole time and that was like annoying because it's uncomfortable. You want to like breathe. I can't really chew gum with a mask on because when you chew gum, the mask slowly like goes down. So like, and I like to chew gum when I'm getting tattooed because it just kind of takes your mind off it. But that was the worst I've had with it is having to wear it all day during a tattoo. But other than other than giving people the reassurance of hey, like it's not going to affect your performance, we know that. Do you have anything else that this like study kind of gave you insight on or that you wanted to share about it?
I don't think so. I do have a comment on the tattoo thing. We'll talk about that. But uh, yeah, I think it's just, I was a little surprised with the RPE stuff. Um, and just by like physiologically, it's not going to do anything. So wear your mask and go work out, have
Yeah.
fun.
It's surprising but reassuring. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
for sure.
So cool. Study two, estimating repetitions in reserve for resistance exercise. Let's dive into this one.
Yeah. So this is building on RPE with reps in reserve, which surprisingly has only been around in the science or in the literature for like 4 or 5 years. So Mike Zordos and Eric Helms have kind of pioneered this field based on a training system created, I guess, by Mike Toucher. And I don't know Mike, I've heard really good things, but um, this is a good example of the fitness world influencing like the scientific world,
Mm.
because now you look at a lot of studies and they almost all use RPE to some extent like this. So it's getting more and more popular.
Can you define RP and RIR just so people are listening if they don't know then like they know.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So it's a 4 or 6 to 10 scale, and basically 10. So if you were doing a set and you hit RPE 10, that was basically like the max you could do, the max reps, the max weight. 9 would be I have like 1 rep left. And then kind of between that 9.5 would be like I can do more weight, but not necessarily more reps. And then you work backwards from there, going down, 8, RPE of 8 would be 2 reps left, RPE of 7 would be 3. And then kind of once you get below like 6 and 5, it kind of bunches together. And so it's not as clear like RPE 5, it's not 5 reps left in the tank. It's like 4 to 6. So that's the basis of it, for people that don't know. It's a really good system.
And that stands for reps or sorry, rate of perceived exertion for those
Mm-hmm.
listening. And then RIR stands for reps in reserve, which is essentially just the inverse. It's just the opposite, right? So like if you did an RPE of 8, that's kind of like saying an RIR of 2.
Yeah.
I think in my opinion, I went from like when RPE really started getting popular, I loved it because I was like, this is so useful because the number one question you get from people who are working with you online versus in person is how much weight should I use? And a lot of times it's like, I don't know because I'm not there with you. I can't tell you what you should be bench pressing based on your body weight because it's different for everybody, So this allows them to go, hey, like this first week of the block, you're going to work up to a 5 rep max and you're going to leave 1 in the tank, right? And now we have kind of like a standard set and we can use an RIR after that to say like, this set is 4 sets of 8 with an RIR2 or an RPE of 8 or whatever it may be. And it kind of allows them to auto-regulate that as they go. The other cool thing about this, like you said, with fitness influencing the science is I believe RPE started in the endurance world. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
then Mike
yeah.
Toucher was the first one to be like, I think we should use this in powerlifting kind of thing.
That's from my understanding, yeah. And I was reading about the origination of the Borg scale. So that's like the first endurance scale,
Mm.
which is 6 to 20. And I was like, why? I've always wondered, why is it 6 to 20? That makes no sense. Like 0 to 10 or 100, or just starting at 0 seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
And it was because they correlated it with endurance exercise and cycle exercise. And the base heart rate is like 60, and then the max heart rate is like 200. So it was 60 to 200, so 6 to 20. So that was the initial idea. Now, obviously, age and sex and fitness play a role in that, and Borg pointed that out in his papers. But it was just, I found that little study, and I was like, wow, that makes so much more sense. There's also an issue with RPE where, like, if you give an RPE of like 4 and an RPE of 2, there's not necessarily like a doubling between those two. It's not like, not linear, but it's basically exponential. Like there's exponential differences between numbers instead of just straight linear numbers. So he figured out that that special number was like 1.6. So.
Mm.
Yeah.
And when was this? Do you know? Was that in the 80s, 90s?
So he started in the 60s and 70s. So it's
Wow.
been around. Yeah. Yeah.
But it translated into the strength world in early 2000s, right?
Yes.
I think you said 2008, if I'm reading correctly.
Yeah,
That
so I don't actually know, like, because I don't know Mike. I don't know when he started using it, but the reference in the paper and kind of what I remember is about 2008, 2005, somewhere in there, but it could have been earlier.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's get back to the study, because I think there's quite a few things I can go on tangents with. Just talking about RPE versus RIR is a whole discussion itself. But I think I'll let you kind of go through the study, and then I'll fire away some questions at the end.
Yeah, so they had 20 guys come in, about 86 kilos. The goal of the study was they're trying to figure out if you blinded the participant to the load, so like you don't know how much you're lifting, does it affect your estimate, your estimated reps in reserve? And like I would think, like I don't know how much is on the bar, I'm just going and I'm going to give you an RPE, that it would affect things because I know about how many reps I can do at a certain weight. Now, these people had never used the RPE RIR system. So that's kind of like, okay, well, you got like fresh people here. So basically what they did was they came in, they did 3 different sessions, kind of like the other study. They did 1 rep maxes for bench press and row. And then the next time they came in, they did 4 sets to failure of 60% of their 1 rep max that they just did. And then the next time they did 4 sets of to failure of 80% of their 1RM. And so they're doing bench press and row each time they come in. Now, initially, they had split the groups because they were like, we're going to have a blinded group or a masked group, and then we're going to have a group that knows exactly how much weight they're doing. And we expect, if we blind people, they won't be able to estimate as good. So it turns out that blinding people doesn't really matter. Like they were essentially the same across the board between the masked condition and the non-masked condition. So what they did after that was they said, okay, these groups don't really matter, so we're going to smash them together. And I've kind of touched on this in previous podcasts where scientists will do this just because that means there's not really a difference there. So then they smashed the data together, got way more people, and you can get a little bit more out of the data. And so they looked at their data on the 60% 1RM and the 80% 1RM. And the main finding, I think, for bench press and row is that their first set, they like severely went over their estimated reps in reserve. So like they estimated they would do 6 or 7, and they actually did like 12. And so that was for bench press and row. But when they went back to the next set, the second set, they were pretty much spot on. And the third set, they were pretty much spot on. So they could predict how many reps they were going to do. And that's at both percentages, 60 and 80.
And that kind of agrees or aligns with what I've said with, like, you need to fail to know how to use RPE properly. to an extent, you know, or at least reach like, I don't want people to go fail and hurt themselves, but like on a row, what are you going to do? You're just going to drop the bar. It's not the big
Yeah.
deal. Bench press, I mean, you could get hurt, but most likely it's going to be embarrassing because it's a big weight on your chest and somebody's got to pull it off. And that's just never fun. In a study, I think that's acceptable, but in a public gym, it's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah.
But that kind of goes aligned with that thought process of like, hey, like we got to push you to failure, you know, in order to see what, or to allow you to gauge your intensity better, your effort better. And there was also an interesting study. I read about it in Mass. I want to say Eric Helms was the one that reviewed it, but it was basically talking about similar thing, bench press. They told people to put their 10 rep max on, I think, the bar, and everybody individually was like, all right, this is my 10 rep, this is my 10 rep. And they all put it on. And the average was like 16 reps. And I think there were some people that hit 26. Like there was a couple people that hit like 11 or 12, but I don't know if there was anybody below the 10. There might've been a couple, but the group average was like 16, I think. And it just goes to show that like without experimenting on that first set, it's really hard to dictate. And a lot of times people don't really, to me, that just shows like you don't know how hard you can or should push. So when people say like, especially for like hard gainers that are like, oh, I'm eating a ton, I'm training really hard, I'm on a program, and it's like, all right, well, you're probably actually not creating enough stress on the muscle. Like you're probably just not going hard enough, which is, especially if you're by yourself, it is difficult to do, but this is a tool that allows you to figure out what that actually looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have, you know, when I used to have clients, I would have people occasionally test like once a month. Hey, go to failure and let's see how much more you can do compared to what you have been doing. Just because you, like you said, it's good to test. I think most people would test on the last set instead of the first set, just so they can do more volume across the sets. So I see that a little more in practice. But yeah, like there's definitely a period where you're doing RIR and you have to figure it out.
Exactly. With this, like I was kind of looking at the like how we apply this. What's your preference for application as far as RPE versus RIR?
Okay, so let me break this up into a couple different categories. So I use it pretty much all the time. I think for physique athletes or people who want to just get like grow muscle and get bigger that aren't like sport, CrossFit, or weightlifting, anything like that related, just general pop plus physique. I would use this like all the time. You can max out occasionally, but it doesn't really help you to max out. Like actually, that's probably time lost recovering and a higher risk of injury than just going with kind of a set to failure every now and then at a lower number of reps than one. So that's how I would apply it to those type of people. For powerlifters, I still like to use percentages because it gives me the ability to say, okay, your 1RM was 400, right? And this mesocycle, we know you've gotten stronger, but we don't really know. So we're going to push your 1RM up to 415. And then all your percentages are going to increase a little bit, right? And then if we go back in and during the program, you're like failing a lot or your RPE is super high, maybe we'll adjust from there. But then we always have that base of, okay, this week I'm going to do 75% 1RM, next week I'm going to do 80. So it lends well to programming for strength athletes. CrossFit, I think you can do like a mix. So that's generally how I would use it in application.
I like that. I think that for me, like with Gen Pop and aesthetically driven people, I'm more on the side of RIR versus RP, just because I think it's easier for them to understand what I mean by that. Because if it's a set of 6 and it's an RPE of 8, people get confused, because it's not 10 reps. A set of 10 is really easy to gauge your RPE, you know what I mean? But I think that's helpful for people to understand. I still personally like to push people close, if not to failure, at least once. Usually not in a 1 rep, but like even if it's like an 8 rep max, I'll say like work to your 8 rep max dumbbell bench press. We want to get to that effort to teach you, and then using RIR to dictate the weights you use. But I like how you said in powerlifting, you still use percentages, which I agree with, and I still do, because that kind of gives you a North Star of what you should be lifting. and then using RPE almost after the fact as a way to use it as a tool to determine how that training looked. Like, in your head, like, all right, you're doing 375. This should be an RPE of 9 for this single or whatever it may be. And they report back like they didn't even make it, or like they're like, I had a few in the tank. Right now, you're like, oh shit, that changes what we think the max is.
Yeah.
And I've never actually, like, I think I've intuitively used it as like a tool after the fact, but I've never really thought of it as a tool after the fact. I've always looked at it as something to dictate how you should train rather than adjusting future training. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And there's something called a global RPE. So you would give an RPE like after the workout, like how hard was this workout on a 1 to 10, or I can't remember if it's a 1 to 5 scale, some scale. And I've used that in the past because sometimes like one exercise will just be super hard, but the rest of the workout is easy. Or maybe you just have like a really hard workout because you didn't eat right or you didn't sleep right, which when you look at a log, like someone's log, you're like, okay, sleep, nutrition, training, how do they interplay with each other? And then you look at their global scale score and it's like really low. And you're like, oh, it's because you were stressed out and all this other stuff. Like, yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between total fatigue and like even just in general of life, and then also effort in the gym, which is the RPE and the RIR, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's important. Which actually that makes me. There's a question I've wanted to ask you for a while, actually, and that's on central nervous system fatigue, which I think would contribute to this idea of global fatigue or global RIR RPE. But pretty recently, like Menno came out with some stuff saying like it's not a thing. Central nervous system fatigue is not real. Like you can't fatigue. But I still hear very intelligent individuals talk about like neurological fatigue, and that is central nervous system fatigue. And I know personally the difference between, like, right now my quads are super sore still from Monday because it's a new block and I haven't done barbell split squats, and it was deficit split squats in a while. Like my quads are crushed, but I feel I have energy. Like my joints don't hurt. I'm not lethargic. I'm not unmotivated. But there's also periods of time where I'm at the end of a block and I like don't want to train. And I don't really have any muscle soreness, but I just feel drained and just zapped, right? To me, I've always looked at that as central nervous system fatigue because it's the easiest way to, one, determine you need a deload, and two, like it kind of allows me to just better like articulate or explain what's going on to somebody, right? Is that accurate, or do you agree with Menno?
Okay, so the issue with central nervous system fatigue is you can't really quantify it on, like, you can quantify it on a scale, but like if I said, it's because of X, like we don't know what X is. So therefore, if like you can't explain it on a scientific level, it must not exist. Like I'm like, okay, so it definitely exists. We just don't know what it is or why it happens.
Is that similar to like the idea that like it's not adrenal fatigue, it's HPA axis dysfunction?
Yeah, kinda. I
Because
think.
to me,
Go
it's
ahead.
like, if you say adrenal fatigue, I'm like, okay, I know what you're talking about. Like I understand that's not the medical term that we need to use, but and I look at that the same way as like central nervous system fatigue. If it explains to me what you're going through, I can better adjust your plan, or vice
Yeah,
versa. Like if I use this terminology, you get it, and now you're like, oh, okay, I do need to manage stress or recover or deload or whatever it may be. Um, so yeah, I still like using it, but when you said that, it kind of reminded me of the adrenal fatigue thing.
yeah, and so if you can use it as a tool, like I think you use it well. You're like, if you can use it to describe your fatigue, that's, and I know now that it's not muscular and it's not like some random thing. That helps me as a coach, or help you as an athlete or whatnot. So I remember I got destroyed during my dissertation defense with, or no, it was my qualifying exam on like trying to define fatigue. And so we started at like the neurological level in the brain, and I had to work all the way down to a muscle fiber, right? And it's been a long time, so don't ask me to do that. But I got to the end, and all they were looking for was for me to do all that and then say, we don't actually know what fatigue, like what causes fatigue, because we've done all of these steps, we've done all of these papers and experiments, and we still don't have like a one thing, because it's probably a lot of little things that add up across the body.
I was going to say that's kind of how I look at central nervous system fatigue as like a cumulative level of fatigue, right? Like that's why when you said global fatigue, it like rung a bell, because to me that's like we don't, people saying like, oh, deadlifts are more going to fatigue your nervous system more. Like I know they're more neurologically demanding, but I think that's an inaccurate statement in the sense that doing heavy deadlifts on Monday and heavy squats on Thursday and high volume on Wednesday and Friday because you have your hypertrophy days and you're getting 6 hours of sleep, like all these things, like that's what's fatiguing, you know, because I know people who, if you get 9 hours of sleep and you only train 3 days a week, fuck, you could lift heavy deadlifts every week and you probably won't need to deload for quite a while, if ever, you know, unless your joints hurt. But so I think it is like that cumulative effect of just like sympathetic tones and just stress until you get to that point.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you can look at, hormones, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, sure. After a while, if you're super lean, like that could be contributing to fatigue, but just like some random week, it's probably not going to be that. So I'll look back into it again to see if like I missed something, but I don't think we have a good definition, and that's why people kind of brush it off.
I think that's the problem with a lot of there's two ends of the spectrum. Like there's like the people who, like, there's obviously pseudoscience, and then there's like science that is like people get so entrenched in the exact terminology and the exact definitions and exact that they lose sight of just helping people, you know, or they like twist things too much, or they get too specific that it like almost what's that it's not procrastination. What's the word I'm looking for? Oh my God. When you're, when you're frozen, you can't do something. You can't make a move. But point being is like paralysis by analysis. That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
It gives you paralysis by analysis because you're so focused on that you just stop taking action. You start to stop doing anything, you know? And then there's obviously the opposite side where they take like one little tiny bit of science and then they try to like make false claims into things that aren't reality or fully true. I watched a really good presentation from Jackson Pios on pseudoscience, and he was talking about like, I mean, some things that are scientifically sound, but they're still pseudoscience because the claims are false, right? Like intermittent fasting was one of them. Like intermittent fasting has benefits, it works, but it's not a fat loss tool because every study used for fat loss purposes shows that if calories are equated, it doesn't make a difference. So, you know, and this is like, I wrote a post about this and I actually ended up taking it down because I was like, I think I needed to reword this because it kind of confused some people. Because in intermittent fasting was one of the ones people were like, well, there's plenty of studies on that. And I'm like, I understand that, but it's the false claims that there's no evidence to back up that people are making, right? And I think that's the problem with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's, oh man, I think that's the hardest thing to fight, is just like you take a study and then you claim one thing that's not even related, and I'm like, how did you get there? And like as a scientist, like I've been doing this for a while, so I understand some nuances, but I don't want to think people just like are dumb if they don't understand science. Like that's not fair.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a struggle. I don't like pseudoscience, and I don't know. I don't know how we go about fixing it.
Well, and I try to tell people too, like if something works for you, do it, because placebo is real. And if that's, you know, because like one of the things I threw on there too was acupuncture, because there's really not a lot of evidence to show that like acupuncture does what they say it does, you know, like balance your chi and all that kind of stuff. But then like you have people that are like, no, this changed my life. And it's like, well, if you believe something enough, it will change your life. And in that scenario, you should keep doing acupuncture because it's helping you. And all I give a shit about is you being happy and getting better, you know. But acupuncture is kind of pseudoscience. Seed cycling is another thing that's kind of pseudoscience, you know, like people swear by it, but there's really no evidence to show that cycling seeds in your diet is going to do it. It's probably just you're adding healthy fats into your diet, and that's affecting the estrogen progesterone balance, and that causes this positive effect. But that's another controversial one that people like change their life, you know?
Yeah, so I had one that I had flipped, like the science had come out enough for me to change my mind on, and that was massages. Like for a long time, there wasn't a great body of literature on massages helping like muscle recovery, which is what, people go get them for.
Hmm.
But then there's a couple studies that came out and I was like, oh man, like you could see it on the molecular level. It's changing these pathways and helping, and this is how it's doing that. And then I was like, okay, so yeah, they're probably beneficial.
Yeah.
But like most people would tell you, oh, I get a massage, I feel great. And you know, not necessarily supported, but change my
Well,
mind.
and this book is probably using older studies because it's uh, I mean, it's been out for a while, but the recovery book by RP was really good. Dr. James Hoffman, and he kind of talks about how there isn't that much to back up massages, but when you go get a massage, there's no phone, there's quiet music, you feel good, there's physical touch, there's all these things that like put you into that parasympathetic mode, just like meditating for an hour, hour and a half, really, right there. And he's like, that's going to lead to significant recovery benefits more so than the actual muscle tissue um, that's happening. And I mean, you saying that makes me even more happy because I get massages once a month for that exact reason. I just feel better, like for multiple reasons. But I think it'd be interesting to do like a whole podcast or something on like pseudoscience and kind of explain to people, because I think there's a lot of people who, they grab onto these things. And I always tell people too, like anytime you hear anything in the dieting world, draw a pathway and see if it leads to a calorie deficit, because if it does, it's probably pseudoscience. Like this isn't a fat loss tool, it's just a tool that might make you fall into a calorie deficit better, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd actually be a good idea. I'll do some looking into that. How I would set up a pseudoscience kind of thing. We have something like how to interpret science in our mentorship, but we don't have like a anti pseudoscience thing.
Be good. The lecture that kind of triggered the thought process to me was it's in the Sports Nutrition Association, and it's like one of the first ones, and it's literally an hour and a half of Jackson just going off on pseudoscience. But he goes outside of nutrition and training too. He starts talking about ghosts and like all kinds of shit. It's actually funny, but it's good, and it makes sense, and it kind of it's helpful for people to hear that kind of stuff, and I think, like you said, like we can talk about how to interpret research and what research is good, but giving some anti-science stuff is like anti-pseudoscience stuff would be super helpful for a lot of people, especially Gen Pop. And I'm going to recreate that post I did and word it differently, because I think there is value in people understanding how to filter good and bad science, and well, science and then pseudoscience basically. And because I had somebody comment on it who is really smart, somebody I respect, and his whole thing was like, he was like, point heard, like I agree with what you're trying to say, but I think wording it this way, blah blah blah. And he started kind of going off, and I was like, okay, you're reaching now, but I get what you mean. And then like I think it confused a couple of just average people, and that's when I was like, okay, I'm going to take this down and repost it, because the purpose was not for coaches, it was for Gen Pop who don't get it,
Mhm.
But I think it would be cool to do a whole blog or a whole podcast on that topic.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
well, cool, man. That's that's basically wrap. Do you have anything to add into at the end of this podcast about those studies?
No, I think they're pretty straightforward. Design wise, these are like easy to analyze and to kind of see how the benefits are, how they compare. The RPE, there is one study that did RPE with RIR versus percentage 1RM. And that was, I think, Helms in 2019. And he actually found that the RPE RIR system worked and better than the percentage-based system. I also think there's a study by the people who use percentage-based training, and it found the opposite thing. So, TBD on that whole, like, which one's better? But it's definitely a system that you can use.
Yeah, I think like to me the conclusion of it all is basically like, number one, don't use the mask as an excuse, and number two, like RPE or RIR or some way of regulating your training loads is advised. Going in the gym
Yeah.
and winging it is not advised, and sometimes going to failure or using percentages helps you dictate what those RPE or RIR levels might be in the future.
Yeah, that's a perfect recap right there.
Cool. Well, cool, man. We'll wrap it up there, guys. As you're listening to this, there's probably a link in the description of this podcast to go check out the blog version if you want to check that out. Otherwise, if you enjoy the podcast, as always, tag us both in your story, take a screenshot. I'll put both of our handles in the description. We'd love to thank you and share it on ours as well. So we will catch you guys next time.